Welcome back to Generals and Napoleon. We have a very, very, very special guest all the way from Sweden today, the great Fredrik Eriksson. Hello, Fredrik.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
For those of you not familiar with Fredrik, he works at the Swedish Defense University, and he's going to talk to us today about which individual?
We're going to talk about Marshal Bernadotte and his workings in Sweden after he leaves Napoleon, more or less.
Right, because I've already done an episode on Marshal Bernadotte's Napoleonic exploits, so I thought it'd be interesting to talk about Bernadotte post-Napoleon, or at least his career in Sweden, so that's what we're going to do today. Before we get to that, though, I know you have a podcast. It's in Swedish, so if I have any listeners who speak Swedish, I recommend you check it out. But it's is it Militär Historia? And could you tell us what that's about?
Militär Historia, yes, it's a podcast that we do just for fun, me and my colleagues. We talk about different topics that interest us, or we interview different people. It could be quite current topics. We brushed on the war, on Russia's war in Ukraine sometimes, but the last year or so, we've been talking quite a lot about coastal fortifications for some reason, just because I'm interested in coastal fortifications, really.
Okay. Well, that sounds interesting. Yeah. And Fredrik's been with the Swedish Defense University for several years now, and is a really good expert that I wanted to have to talk about not only Bernadotte, but his ancestors who still are on the throne in Sweden. So that's kind of what we're going to dive into today. Let's begin. What is the overall feeling today towards Bernadotte in Sweden today?
If you talk about Karl Johan, as his name is in Swedish, Charles John, or so in a way, and he is an important figure, but he's not really remembered as such. But if you talk about his dynasty and monarchy in general, they have quite a lot of support, actually. Okay. I looked into it right now, and I found there are several actually polls about this. And I found one from last autumn of 2023, and 68% is in favor of the monarchy.
Okay. But before we get into House Bernadotte, let's briefly go over the history of Swedish kings leading up to him. What was the state of the Swedish monarchy in the 1790s, early 1800s? I know King Gustav III was assassinated in 1792. Can you kind of give us the background leading up to Bernadotte?
Yeah, absolutely. The 1700s is a period of quite a lot of trouble in Sweden, as Sweden loses or are losing its great power position in the Baltic area. And it's really the Great Northern War that ends in 1721. It starts in 1700, so it goes on for 20 years. And Sweden is at war with Denmark and Brandenburg and Saxony, Poland, and Russia for more than 20 years. And it doesn't really end good. And that starts a downward spiral, more or less. But after Charles XII dies in 1718, a period is called the Age of Liberty, where the parliament has power, more or less, and the kings are degraded in a way, replaced with a name stamp, actually. And when Gustav III becomes king, he becomes king with a very, very liberal law system, or for instance, it's the first Freedom of the Press Act in the world that you have. But when he comes to power, one of the first things that he actually do is he makes a coup d'etat. And he doesn't really call it that, but he takes power and becomes king again, like a despotic king. And that's what actually starts an ongoing political battle, really, between royalty and between the nobility and the nobles that have been in charge up until then. So they lose power quite a lot. In the early 1700s, there are two political parties called Hats and the Caps. It's funny names, but and actually the Hats are supported by France and want to go to war with Russia all the time. The Caps, more England, Russia, don't really want to go to war with anybody. So you have an ongoing political conflict, really. And that's what you see when Gustav III is murdered in 1792. So that's one of the big things that you can see going on here in the late 1700s.
Yeah, even his murder though is it's somewhat dramatic too, right? Like he got a letter that said, you know, that you may be killed tonight, and he was like, yeah, whatever, and he went to I think it was a costume party or something like that.
Yep, it's a costume party at the opera. Where he has his own rooms at the opera. And but Gustav III he's a theater king. He's often said to be a theater king. He writes his own plays and he plays in them, etc. But he is a ruthless person as well. One has to realize. And when you see him in movies and etc., he's often portrayed as quite feminine, wearing makeup, etc. But I mean, this is one of the most ruthless kings that have had power, because he goes to war himself. He leads armies himself. He's not afraid of anything, and that's why he goes to the party, to the costume party, and everybody knows who he is.
And he's not killed outright, right? Like he survives for a little bit.
No, it takes 2 weeks more or less. For him to die. You can still see they put him in a chair, and you can still see that chair. It's still kept, so you can see the blood stains on the chair. But it takes him 2 weeks to die.
And then his son Gustav IV takes over. How did he perform as king?
He is not his father's son. He is not. He does not have the character his father had, and the political knows, because Gustav III, he could talk to people and he maneuvered. So he used like the peasants and the bourgeoisie against the nobles. Gustav IV couldn't, because he did not have that political character, and he couldn't.
That diplomatic skill that you need.
The diplomatic skill, exactly. Yeah. Because one thing that is important to remember is that Gustav III, he goes to war with Russia in 1788, and one of the first things and it doesn't really go all that well, but one of the things that happens there is what's called the Anjala Union, which is a group of officers that more or less rebel against him and say, we want peace with Russia and we want to go back to the old ways, more or less, when we were in charge and you weren't. So and they are this rebellion is put down, but I think one person is actually executed. But he uses the other groups against the nobles.
Right.
So you have a political conflict going on.
Yeah, it's hard to turn back the clock. I know when Louis XVIII came back to France after Napoleon had been there for 15 years, he tried to go back to the way things were, and people were like, no, your time is, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Exactly that. The same kind of opposition from nobles and the nobility meets Gustav IV, and he's a very headstrong man, very, very stubborn. And you have the French Revolution, etc., all of those things going on. But then you also have when the Napoleonic Wars starts.
Yep.
And Gustav IV Adolphus, this is really his name. He actually hates Napoleon. When you read his letters, etc., I mean, he really hates Napoleon, and he's one of those one of the leaders or kings in Europe that actually stands against Napoleon.
Mm-hmm.
Not very, very successfully, but
No.
So it doesn't end well at all for
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
Actually.
And I know the Swedish army gets involved on the side of the Allies, and
Yep. Yeah.
like all the Allies in 1805, 6, and 7, they don't do very well against Napoleon.
No, they don't. No, they don't.
So Gustav IV is deposed in 1809.
Mm-hmm.
What were the reasons for this? Was it his losses against Napoleon? Was it his relationship with the nobles?
It's a bit of both, actually. It is not that he's against Napoleon, although this noble opposition against him are more revolutionary or more Napoleonic minded. But it really has to do with the war with Russia in 1808, 1809, the Finnish War. That comes after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, when Napoleon forces the Russians to enter into the alliance, etc., but also to take Finland from Sweden. So it doesn't, and that war is it's an interesting war to study, but it doesn't end well for Sweden. And in that war, Gustav IV, he already has a lot of enemies, but he makes a few more. He degrades all the guards regiments because he thinks they're cowards. So he deposes them of their ranks and everything, which doesn't really the
go
officers
over well,
don't.
yeah.
No, they don't. Doesn't really go that well with the officer corps.
Yeah.
So he is deposed. A rebellion starts actually in it's called the Western Army. Stands against the Norwegian border. So they start marching against Stockholm, towards Stockholm. But before they get there, there's a group of nobles that depose him in Stockholm.
Yeah, could have been a really bad civil war, so I'm glad. Probably
it
a
could
good
have
thing.
been a bad
depose.
civil war, yes, but this is another coup d'etat in 1809. It is a military coup, really.
Interestingly, they pick a guy who might actually be worse. Gustav's uncle is proclaimed King Charles XIII. He's the brother to King Gustav III, the guy who was assassinated a little while ago.
Yep.
Who is this guy? How did they land on this guy?
Well, he's the next in line to the throne. If you depose of Gustav IV, you don't know. Well, Gustav IV also has a son. I have to remember that. But they depose of them. So he's sent into exile, Gustav IV and his son, and they have to choose somebody. So they take Charles XIII.
Yep.
Gustav IV's uncle, and he's the younger brother of Gustav III. He's the great admiral, so he's been to war a few times. He's not that successful, but he's also a mysticist and kind of into Freemasonry and things like that. But he is. He's probably also involved in these plans to depose his nephew. He's one of those.
He's 60 years old when he takes over, and
yes,
he's somewhat infirmed during the reign, right? Like he's
old. He's old, and he's quite ill during his reign, and he doesn't have any legitimate children. He has a bunch of other children.
Well, so therein lies the problem. Like we have this guy who's 60. He's not very healthy. He has no legitimate children. And even though he rules till 1818, Sweden realizes we need to find a crown prince. So how did they select Bernadotte? I mean, he was an impressive marshal, but not one of Napoleon's best.
No.
Who were the other candidates? Did they look around Europe, or how did they settle upon Bernadotte, do you think?
Yeah, this is an interesting episode. First, they choose the noble groups around Charles XIII. They pick a Danish prince, Carl August. He is he's a very, very popular guy. he's also related to the Swedish, the monarchy as such, the Swedish kings. So he's the first choice. He's the really first choice, and he's a quite important and, as I said, popular guy. But the thing is, he dies very, very suddenly. So he's adopted by Charles XIII, but he dies from stroke. Actually, he's on military maneuvers, and he dies like that. But when he dies, there are rumors that he is poisoned, actually, by the Gustavians, or the people behind or around Gustav III and Gustav IV. And there is a lot of political turmoil surrounding his death. And there is a big monument at the place where he actually died. And then you come into the position, okay, we need another.
I've heard they also looked at Prince Eugene, Napoleon's stepson.
Yeah. They have looked at different persons of people who should replace. But Carl August is one thing that is also interesting is that when he is buried in Stockholm in 1810, you have a big riot. It's called the assassination of von Fersen. And von Fersen is an interesting guy also. But he is Axel von Fersen. He is one of the guys around Gustav III, but he's also an ambassador to France before the French Revolution. And he is the lover of Marie Antoinette, which is, so he's a really, really important guy. And he's the foremost Gustavian. And when they are burying Carl August, he's murdered by a mob in Stockholm.
It sounds like a movie, like all this drama.
Yes, it is. It is really like a movie. So in this process, and he is murdered, of course, by the opposition. It's an instigated murder because they do not want the foremost Gustavian in place.
Well, I've also read that, during the Napoleonic Wars, Bernadotte captured a small Swedish army, but a Swedish army nonetheless. And apparently he treated them very well. And the officers went back to Sweden and said, this guy might be the right guy.
I've heard that story too. There can be some truth to it. I really think that they want this opposition around Charles, the opposition to the Gustavians, the officers surrounding Charles XIII. They really want a guy who can take back Finland, beat the Russians. That's what they really want. And when you're entering into these periods, 1810, 11, the relationship between Napoleon and Russia is going quite bad.
Yeah, and Bernadotte, for all his foibles, he was a good general. He was a good administrator. Although he and Napoleon didn't really get along because they were, in my opinion, they were very similar people. And they have a big talk before Bernadotte takes the crown prince role, and Napoleon says, "Look, don't turn against me." And Bernadotte wisely says, "Well, I can't promise you that. It depends on your behavior." So why did Bernadotte eventually have to turn on Napoleon, do you think?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because actually when he's chosen as king, it's a guy called Mörner, who is the so-called kingmaker, and he asks him really to just become king. And when he becomes king and starts to do his analysis of what we're going to do, really, this is when you see that he starts to actually turn on Napoleon quite early. One thing that we have to remember is that, as you said, they are quite similar people. And Bernadotte is not the greatest of generals or marshals among the French marshals. He's an okay general, but he's really an administrator and a political mind. He's a political man. And Napoleon and him, they already have a kind of a falling out concerning Desiree Clary, because there are things that goes on there too.
Yep.
Yep.
That's an excellent point. For those who don't know, Bernadotte's married to Napoleon's ex-girlfriend, Desiree Clary, which actually brings me to my next point. So Bernadotte takes the crown prince role. He moves to Sweden.
Yep.
How did he adjust to his new environment, and how did Desiree adjust to her new country?
Bernadotte, he finds himself quite well in this new role. Actually, there are stories that he wants his rooms heated up very, 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 very warm, and he doesn't really go out of bed until late in the afternoon. So he sits in bed and dictates all his letters, etc. Desiree Clary, Desiree or Queen Desideria, that she's called in Sweden, she doesn't like it at all.
No.
That's why she lives in Paris. So she stays in Paris. Yeah.
Yeah, which is shocking. Like your husband's ruling a country and you're still in Paris, but But eventually she does join him there.
Yeah, she does. But she doesn't like it at all, actually. So she lives. She has her own palace actually that she lives in, right outside Stockholm. But she really she has a strange rhythm. She goes up around 2 or 3 in the afternoon and she stays awake all night, etc. Lots of funny things about that.
I've heard she would call on people like at 3 a.m. because that's when she was up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So her ladies in waiting had to stay up all night. They also had to dress in white because they were when they were walking in the gardens outside. She was afraid of bats, and so her ladies in waiting had to wear white to actually attract the bats.
She's definitely a unique lady. She was different absolutely. For sure.
Yeah. She lives she becomes very, very old actually. She actually she carries the later king Gustav V to his baptism. In I think it's 1858 before she dies, and the present king was carried to his baptism by Gustav V.
Wow!
So they become very, very old, and it's very, very close when you realize that our king today has been sitting on the lap of Gustav V, who is carried to his baptism by a woman born before the French Revolution.
Yeah, but a woman who knew Napoleon, which is crazy to think about.
Exactly. It's really crazy to think about it.
Well, after Napoleon's downfall in 1815, his final downfall, what were some of the big achievements for Bernadotte?
We have to realize that Bernadotte is the creator of modern Sweden. He is the one that does the analysis and says that, okay, we cannot recapture Finland. So we will have to stay out of great power conflicts, neutrality, non-alliance, and also try to balance between great powers. Take Norway. That is one of the big things. He takes Norway from Denmark, reduces Denmark to minor power. And then, so the union between Sweden and Norway, it's an island. So strategically, he is the creator of modern Sweden. His other achievements, apart from that, is that he pays off the national debt, which is quite substantial after many years of war. He also accepts relatively liberal economic policies. He is not a liberal. You have to realize that he becomes increasingly conservative over the years. So these are some of his greater achievements after that in somewhere around freedom of the press, etc. One thing that comes during his reign is public schooling. In 1840, public school for everybody, 1840.
Smart.
Yes, so he does quite a lot of these things, political reforms, not political reforms, economic reforms, not really political reforms. And he becomes increasingly conservative, actually.
Yeah, he could be quite autocratic, and he sometimes censored the press.
Absolutely, he does.
And I read an article or a story. It was, I think some students were protesting, and Bernadotte would get into a fit, and he'd say, "Oh, I'll make the gutters run red with blood." And Desiree would say, calm down, Bernadotte. You couldn't string the neck of a cat if you wanted to.
He does a few of these things, actually, but as you say, he becomes quite autocratic. And the freedom of the press, it's a law that comes in 1812, but that allows him to actually withdraw newspapers. And he does that all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And as the 1800s progress, there is quite a lot of liberal opposition against his autocratic tendencies. And whenever anybody writes about it, he withdraws the newspaper. And then they publish another one with a new name and continue. There is an ongoing...
Continue.
Yeah. There is one paper that still exists. It's called Aftonbladet, or the Evening News. It's founded in 1830, and the founder just publishes second evening news, third evening news, fourth evening news, and it's just against the king. So that goes on as a political struggle, more or less.
Yeah, his popularity decreased for a little while in the 1830s, but then it seems like towards the end of his reign, he rises again. How long did he reign for, and when did he die?
He reigns until his death in 1844. So he's 81 years old by then, and he dies of old age. But for the last few years of his life, not much happens, actually.
Yeah.
And there aren't any... the reforms that he started in 1820s, economic reforms, more or less, it kind of stagnates and things doesn't really progress that much. But he dies in 1844.
Okay. And his son Oscar takes over the role. Oscar, who was actually, I think, born in France, and some say was named by Napoleon, takes over as king. How did he perform?
He performs quite well, actually. He dies quite young. Actually, he dies only in 1859. So he's not. He doesn't reign for all that long. What he does is he does a few tax reforms, economic reforms, but he also he wants to play a larger role, actually, in power politics. So he. During his reign, you have the Crimean War, for instance. The French and the British really want Sweden to join the alliance against Russia, and sometimes we should get the Åland Islands or Finland or etc. And when Sweden said, "Yeah, sure, why not?" Then the British and French, well, they lost interest. But Oscar I was one of these characters that could imagine actually going to war with Russia, and he also makes makes an underhand deal with the British concerning this.
And Oscar, correct me if I'm wrong, marries the daughter of Prince Eugene de Beauharnais. Is that right?
I think so. Yes. Yeah. But one thing that also happens during his reign, it's the rebellious year of 1848. Where there are first riots in Sweden, but there are revolutions all over in Europe, in France. Yep. And there's also a war between Prussia and Denmark, which involves Sweden and Norway also. We're not at war, but we send troops, Swedish and Norwegian troops, to Denmark to support the Danes against the Prussians. Because this is the age of Scandinavism. The kings of Sweden and Denmark are actually in quite well off with each other. So they are trying to form alliances, and as such.
Yeah, it's all very interesting, all this activity. But for the most part, and we'll come to this in the legacy question. Sweden has remained neutral.
Yeah, absolutely.
For the most part, since 1815,
Yeah.
How have
there are a few? I mean, there are talks,
instances.
But it's a neutral country. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So Oscar dies, like we said, pretty early. His mom is there to attend the funeral. How have Bernadotte's other descendants performed?
It varies a bit. The successor to Oscar is Charles XV, and he's a he's a happy-go-lucky guy. He likes drinking, riding, and women. That's what he does. He dies without children, legitimate children. He has a bunch of illegitimate children, and after that comes Oscar II and all of the other kings and queens after him. But the thing is, what these Bernadottes actually managed to do is maintain influence and actually also allow reform. And this is why they are or have been quite successful in the period during the 20th century, 1900s. For instance, you have the Second World War, which is a big problem where you need the king as a unifying factor, etc.
Yep.
So they have been quite successful in managing political opinion. And Sweden has been run by social democracy for a larger part of the 20th century. And they are Republicans. But they have never, ever for real tried to actually turn Sweden into a republic.
Right.
It has been said that one social democratic leader has said that, well, if we do that, that will be the last thing we ever do.
Yeah, it actually leads up to my final point is we talk about Swedish neutrality, which recently just ended with the joining of NATO. But what is Bernadotte's legacy both in Sweden and in the world? Because I think Sweden, it sounds very positive. The world, I mean, maybe most people don't know who he is, even though he's an important figure. What do you think his legacy is?
For Sweden, his legacy is enormous. And if there's one man that we should actually look to say that this is the very, very one of the more important figures in our history, he is one of them. He is. I don't think most people would say that, but I really do believe that he is. If you look at what he actually starts, he starts an age of prosperity, and he starts an age of peace
and stability. Yeah, because
absolutely.
Before that, as we mentioned at the beginning, you had all this upheaval and drama.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what you have here is stability, peace, and political, economic development, actually.
But worldwide, his legacy, I mean, you could point that, his descendants are still on the throne and Sweden is still Sweden.
Yes. But I think that is perhaps his legacy in the world, although people in general, I don't think really know who he is. But in the Scandinavian context, he is quite important.
Yeah, and I think he threw himself into his work. He said, "Hey, I'm king of this country now. I want to see it prosper. Even though I came from a warmonger background with Napoleon, I don't want to get in any more wars. I've seen enough."
He's seen enough, and it's also but that's his political sense, that he actually realizes that if we go to war, this is very, very. You never know the end. And where it will end. The end game of it. You're right.
Yeah, and what happened to Napoleon, I'm sure, was a good lesson for Bernadotte. Like, I don't want that to happen to me or Sweden.
Exactly. That's what he is actually very conscious about, because first of all, you have Gustav IV. He is alive. I don't remember when he dies. He dies in Switzerland. But his son is alive until the 1870s. He dies in 1877, I think, in Vienna. But he dies childless. There is an alternative. And for a large part of the 1800s, you have Gustavians and people that actually were looking to, we should perhaps replace this usurper, etc. So there are these groups as well.
Right.
And he's very conscious about that.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a whole group of people who are legitimists and want this other guy on the throne, you have to be very careful with how you handle the throne. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
That is his political. He has a political nose that is spectacular in many ways. Actually, that he uses it and he understands the political situation and he can deal with it.
Yeah, no, he's an interesting guy for sure.
Yeah, he really is. He really is.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Fredrik. Again, Fredrik's joining us from Swedish Defense University. Thank you for them to reaching out to me. And the podcast, one more time, is called
Militärhistoria.
And you can hear it anywhere podcasts are heard. Yep.
Yes, you can find it on Spotify and others, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, thank you again for joining us.
Absolutely.